Hey everyone, I am Thomas the Tank Engine, Happy Tree Friends fan 2012 here, and today I'm going to give you something similar to Porterverse Lore Ramblings by the amazing Fire Porter, who is an absolute legend and you should subscribe to him. Anyway, I'm going to be telling you all some certain things in my take on Thomas and Friends that is just my own thing and that's such as rewriting certain stories. First one up is
Toby's New Whistle.
an episode we can all universally say sucks. For those who need context, I'll give you some context. In this episode, Toby the tram engine is stuck at the steamworks getting his bell fixed. While he does so, he ends up getting a 3-chime steam whistle, given to him by Victor. Then James puffs into the steamworks, complimenting Toby about how he used to have a 3-chime whistle. He also delivered the Fat Controller. The Fat Controller gives Toby the job of collecting Dowager Hat for a certain event. Toby agrees to such. However, he's still concerned about his new 3-chime whistle. As James says, it's loud and booming, which doesn't really suit Toby's vibe. And then the rest of the episode kind of plays out how a typical Sharon Miller episode plays. Now, there are a few good issues to be had in this episode, but I'll nail down 2. For one thing, Toby does have a whistle, you know. He had one in the episode Bullseye, and generally throughout season 3 and 4, he generally had a whistle. The other issue I want to talk about is James says he has used a 3-chime steam whistle once before. What? How I have no memory of James ever using a 3-chime whistle, and it's just weird. Like, why of all characters do you pick James to say this? And no, I don't qualify 3 chimes the charm like Kiefer Adams, even if it's kinda goated. Basically, I'm still in the idea of how I can change this episode to make it actually decent. But one thing I can promise is that I will eventually remake this episode. One thing I will say I'm doing is that James's role in the episode is going to be swapped with Hank. If you're wondering why the hell I chose Hank, let me explain. For one thing, Hank is an American engine, and thus makes more sense if he had a 3-chime whistle. I actually did research, and Hank is based on the Pennsylvania K4 locomotives. I also looked up do Pennsylvania K4 class engines use 3-chime whistles, and turns out they do. So it would make more sense for Hank to be in James's role, as he's not only an American engine, but also has some historical accuracy with using a 3-chime whistle. The second reason I chose Hank is because I feel like he's overlooked by the fandom. Just because he's this big hulking American engine with a very deep blue and red livery doesn't mean you should disappoint him, man. He's cool. So generally, that's the reason I decided Hank could be in James's role. As for the other reason, how Toby works around the logic of him needing a whistle, I'm still yet to kind of make a 100% accurate statement. Since I do qualify this episode canon, but with a lot of differences. Also, personal opinion here, Keith Wickham Percy isn't that bad. Just because he's squeaky. Like, brother, that's the same excuse every time. By the way, am I the only one who doesn't mind too much about Nitrogen's animation? Okay, ignoring that tangent, let's go on to another episode. The next episode I'll talk about is
Edward Strikes Out.
Again, an episode that no one in the vicinity of the fandom even likes. So, again, let me do a statement of this episode. In this episode, Thomas, Gordon, and Edward are at Brendam Docks where they see a large new red crane. Gordon is this Crane ends up being the character Rocky. Thomas jokes to Gordon that the crane is so big he could probably lift the big engine up. Gordon, on the other hand, does not take this so kindly. Gordon also states that the crane is just a waste of money, considering the fact that Rocky is not capable of moving on his own, and thus Gordon deems him as newfangled nonsense. And Edward, for some damn reason, agrees with him. This is the main issue with the episode. Edward is just not characteristically accurate. Then Percy pops in just to give out the public statement of what the hell is a newfangled nonsense, being as dumb as he always is. And Edward looks like he's mad. When Edward is also scheduled to take a train of pipes to a location that's not said in the episode. Rocky offers to help him, but Edward declines him, once again stating Rocky's a load of newfangled nonsense. Later on in the episode, Edward has to come to a sudden stop due to a red signal. But in typical Sharon Miller fashion, Edward does not wait for the pipes to be tied down, and when he comes to a stop, they all come crashing down. I'm not going to bother explaining the rest of the episode. All you need to know is that Gordon crashes, Edward apologizes to Rocky, and then Rocky is no longer newfangled nonsense. Yay! Okay. The main issue with this episode is how horribly inaccurate of character portrayal Edward ends up being in this episode. He's just so judgmental to Rocky for no reason, and for whatever reason agrees with Gordon's statement. Personally, most fans, including me, prefer to imagine that this episode is about James and Rocky. Personally, just take out Edward and swap him for James, and I think you actually have something. Now, personally, where I like to imagine this episode could have worked is that James is only really judgmental to Rocky due to the fact he's red. I know that sounds a little bit stupid, but by this point, James was still a wee bit self-centered about his regal livery, so I think it's a little decently accurate. And generally, James would be judgmental to Rocky, mainly due to the fact he's red. When Gordon says Rocky's a load of newfangled nonsense, James would somewhat agree with him, but he'd be more concerned about the fact Rocky is painted in a livery that James does not find very suitable. And essentially, that's how most Thomas fans imagine Edward Strikes Out could have worked. And basically, it's just James as the main character. Now then, the next episode I'd like to reimagine is
Spotless Record.
Now, this is an episode most Thomas fans like, but there's a specific reason I've chosen this one. I'll get to that in a second, but first, let's do a episode description. Thomas and Percy are introduced to a new dark red maroon tank engine named Arthur. The Fat Controller states that Arthur has a spotless record. Then Thomas explains to Percy how the spotless record means that Arthur's never been cheeky or had an accident. Okay, I might shorten episode descriptions from here on out because they're getting a bit tiresome to do. Now, I don't have an issue with how the episode is written, aside from one thing, and I genuinely am a fan of Arthur, but aside from this episode, he doesn't really do much. And that's kind of where my issue sort of hits Arthur. What does he really do afterwards? He works on a branch line around fish. And that's it. He was never seen again. In the episode, Thomas and Percy play a trick on Arthur by just sending a line of vans full of fruit, just taking the living Christ out of Arthur. Now, personally, I don't think Thomas and Percy are that good of characters to put into the role. Rather, I would actually swap their roles for Bill and Ben. I think Bill and Ben just work better in the roles, considering they are still tank engines, and they are also and also notoriously are quite cheeky. And I feel like they would just have an absolute ball taking the Christ out of Arthur. They would maybe even try and do with something similar to the Diesel, where they just run laps around Arthur. And then Bill and Ben are often seen at Brendam sometimes. And since the China Clay Works is close to Brendam in the series, I think it works better for Bill and Ben to be in the episode. Besides, their other episode about Bill and Ben, Bother is also a pretty bad episode. I'll cover that at another time, but for now, Bill and Ben, basically, I will rewrite the episode to have Bill and Ben take Thomas and Percy's role. And aside from that, that's basically all I really do with the episode. I'm a fan of it I like the episode as it is, but it could have worked better if Thomas and Percy's roles were swapped for Bill and Ben. Now, my next episode for rewriting is Harvey to the Rescue. Another kind of mediocre episode, but let me just do a quick description of it. Thomas and Percy arrive at Brendam Docks to see the arrival of the railway inspectors and a new tank engine painted maroon with a large crane arm on his roof named Harvey. It's later seen in the episode that Harvey feels upset about being around the other engines, considering they will often the other engines make fun of Harvey because of his crane arm, and understandably, Rocky's a little bit sad about it. And then afterwards, Percy has an accident. Harvey goes to save him, and then the other engines are pleased to consider Harvey a member of the Fat Controllers Railway. Mainly, my issue with this episode is that Edward doesn't play a major role in the episode, but for some reason he's insulting Harvey. For some reason, wouldn't it be better if you just swapped him for Thomas in this episode? Since Edward also works at Brendam, I think he'd be a believable character to meet Harvey, along with Salty, who at this point was introduced. So basically, I would rewrite this episode to have Thomas and Edward's roles swapped, because it makes more sense for Thomas to be the one insulting Harvey rather than Edward. So yeah, that's kind of basically it. On to the next one. The next episode is
Tram Truck.
Yep, it's a season 12 episode. A season that no one really likes. To put this, I'm not gonna even bother showing screenshots, so all you need to know is this is the one episode we see Flora, the yellow steam tram, and Thomas is worried about her being around, considering Toby would be a one-of-a-kind tram engine, being the only steam engine, or even a tram, on the island of Sodor, and Thomas feels worried about him if he catches a glimpse at Flora, who is a new steam tram. Basically, I would actually change this episode to be about Flora and Stanley. If I hear any comments that say welcome Stanley in the comments, I swear to God. No. Why I chose Stanley to be in the role is that I think it was stated that Stanley is a... Personally, my take is that Stanley worked at Grey Waterton, considering he was basically the engine that had to kind of get the orders around, which thus made Thomas a wee bit mad, but that's in the Great Discovery, and we're not talking about movies, we're talking about episodes and characters. Basically, I would just forget Thomas and we just put Stanley in this role, because I think Flora it's less about Flora trying to stay away. It's less about Toby finding out about another steam tram, rather than more than it should be just about Stanley feeling a little bit trying to teach Flora the way around. So basically, my reality is that Stanley and Flora work on the Grey Waterton tramway. The Grey Waterton line. I cannot speak today, can't I? Okay, I'm done with episodes, so let's do some characters. First character is Lady. Now, in my universe, Lady is a real engine on Sodor. Okay, yeah, I know. No, you need to leave! Alright, let me explain myself. Now, the events of Thomas and Magic Railroad are somewhat canon, minus the entire human needs gold dust, small size human needs gold dust from Magical Tank Engine. Lady is the Magical Tank Engine. Personally, here's how I perceive the events. In 1993, the Fat Controller decides to invest in a tank engine, in an old private tank engine painted in gold and gold and purple. This engine would be Lady, and Lady can often be seen shunting, pulling smaller passenger and pulling small passenger trains. Though will often also be seen as a private engine for the Fat Controller. Essentially, Lady is a private engine. So, yep, that's how I work Lady into my Thomas series. Her being a private engine, but also be able to work as a shunter and being able to pull light passenger trains is a neat idea. On to the next character. Next up on the list of Rooney are Bash, Dash, and Ferdinand. Third log and loco. Now, before you go asking CCT and HTFM, how on Christ's green earth would you get these hillbilly locomotives to actually exist in the Thomas universe? Let me explain. Personally, I think it's a neat idea that Bash, Dash, and Ferdinand basically I still try and keep in with the TV show logic where the characters were misbehaving on the mainland and thus were sent onto a little island on a very small island around west of Sodor. That around west of Sodor there is a little itty bitty island named Misty Island, known for its rather mysterious mist that is quite a common occurrence. Some say it's where engines who are misbehaving too much will always be dumped and left to rot and rust away until they're nothing. Basically, I like to imagine Bash, Dash, and Ferdinand were sent there in disgrace, but they were actually fine adapting their lives on this island. Their drivers would still stay with them, and there was a population around this island. Not majorly, but still enough to make a business. And basically, they would work on that little island for a few years until around, let's say the mid 2000s, where the island was discovered by Rosie from the north, who by this point is still pink. Rosie finds them and is like, "Who the hell are you at?" And they're like, "We're the Lagging Locos." They're basically, and by this point, they had the mentality that they are logging locos, as the town have so kindly called them. So, basically, by this point, Rosie decides to let the logging locos sometimes visit Sodor with permission from the Fat Controller and the residents of Misty Island. And basically, Bash, Dash, and Ferdinand would have different personalities. Within TV show canon, Ferdinand was described to be a gentle giant of sorts. Well, in the TV series, he only said 2 flipping words. I'm not gonna bother saying them because you know what I mean by that. Basically, I make him more of a gentle giant, more true to what a character bio of him says. And Bash and Dash, although appearing to be twins, have quite different personalities. Bash is the older, more timid one of the two. He's not as but 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 more brave. Meanwhile, Dash is more optimistic, a little bit crazy at times, but not as brave as his older brother. And that's how I work the logging locos into this series. I know it sounds a little weird, but do you know what? You just gotta work with what you gotta work with. Okay. What's your name? It's me! By the way, here's a little something about Rosie in my series. Rosie never gets repainted maroon. She always stays pink. Because I'm just more of a fan of her pink livery. I don't hate her red livery, but she just looks more iconic in pink. I'm sorry. Next up on the list is Dennis and Norman. Now, for those who are wondering, who do I pick? Dennis or Norman? Mate, it's not even a competition. Dennis for the win. In fact, I'm axing Norman from the series. I have 3 reasons why. First of all, Norman has done next to nothing to make himself a worthy character in the Thomas and Friends series. That checks out. Second of all, he has probably the most. He goes for great merchandise of him, whether Wooden Railway or Take and Play, go for mental amounts on eBay. And I really don't see the point in trying to acquire a second Dennis just to make him. And thirdly, most Thomas fans often say that Norman and Dennis just both exist in the same universe. I'm sorry, but if we're qualifying real life history, in which there was only one of these engines built, being this one, then Norman just can't exist. I'm sorry, but Norman goes bye-bye. At the very least, Dennis had a personality trait, and one that wasn't often really seen on Thomas characters at that. So, yeah, Dennis wins. And he is canon to the series, so don't you worry. Anyway, next Thomas and Friends character we know shall be. Actually, let me state something first. And this isn't TV series related. Now, I'm going to do a quick and snappy list of Railway series characters who are not canon into the series. The Sigurd of Arsdale, the Blister Twins, Albert, and Ivo Hugh. I'm sorry, but these characters just are not going to be canon. They don't really do anything, and hell, half of them aren't even shown. In fact, personally, this is Daniel, and this is the cooler Daniel. Yeah, Freddy's just a little more intriguing to me. I'm sorry, I have a few fans, but nah, he ain't canon. Okay. Here's something else I want to state, and this is related with characters in both the that are in both the TV series and Railway series. Thomas does not get a flat footplate. I'm sorry, but it just doesn't look right. And Donald and Douglas do not get repainted blue in my series. Basically, Thomas just keeps his sloped footplate, and Donald and Douglas remain black. Albeit, Donald and Douglas also gain a splash of white on their footplates when they're bought, which then would give them a bit of unique coloring, I guess, to slightly differentiate them from the official series. And that's it. That's the Railway series bit done. Now, one more character. And this character is Hero. Yeah, Hero is a bit of an oddball, to be honest. Now, I never knew this until recently in Unlucky Tug's video, but in real life, the The D5 ones were actually produced but were first produced in the mid 1930s, while Sodor was first opened back in 1915. And if we're taking the logic that Hero says he's the first engine to work on Sodor, yeah, that just ain't gonna work. And thus for him, I've decided to work something. Hiro worked in Japan for a good chunk of his life, until around, let's say, the 50s, where Hiro was just dumped and left on Sodor due to him not being needed. He was left in the forest for around the same time Duke was locked in his shed, except Hiro was actually exposed to the elements and thus to rust and overgrowth started to make him disappear. That is until around the mid 2000s, where Stanley ends up discovering Hiro, and with a word from the Fat Control, and a similar plot to Hero the Rails happens, except Stanley plays a main role. Instead of Thomas, it's Stanley, and eventually, eventually, Hiro is eventually a Sodor engine. Yay! Basically, that's just how I work Hiro into the Thomas series while keeping his basis the same. Alright, I think I have enough time to squeeze in one more character. And this character is Whiff, the Rubbish Engine. Insert a nerd joke here because funny. Now, Whiff has the same design and number as Arrowlight. However, Arrowlight is a fully unique engine. There are no other engines like him. And thus comes the question. How do Whiff and Arrowlight exist in the same universe? Well, here's my theory. Around the 1960s, there were plans to build a replica engine of Arrowlight's current design. However, it wasn't exactly perfect. There was a few things wrong. And maybe there being a few things wrong kind of led to Whiff gaining his infamous spectacles. Eventually, the engine was built, but unlike the real-life Arrowlight, the engine never saw interest in doing regal passenger work, and was more into the idea of collecting rubbish. And thus, the builders were eventually caught and arrested. But their engine was eventually sent to Sodor in around the late 70s. And thus Whiff became a fully qualified engine on the Fat Controls Railway, and would do rubbish collecting work for a good few years, until the mid 2010s, where Whiff decided it was time to change it up a bit. And thus Whiff decided to also ask the Fat Controller if they could do a fully new project of making a complementary area in the general space of the waste dump by including something known as a recycling complex. And thus to this day, Whiff is currently doing recycling work, tying in with All Engines Go, and how in the All Engines Go series, Whiff does not seem to be interested in doing rubbish work, but instead is more of a fan of collecting recycling. However, the rubbish collecting duty was kinda dying off a bit on Sodor, hence why Scruff could handle it on his own accord, and thus Whiff could work at a recycling complex. And thus, that's how I work Whiff into the series, and also giving him a unique character portrayal later on to match in with All Engines Go. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the end of my current and Thomas and Friends video about changing characters and all that rubbish, and, that sort of stuff. With that out of the way, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you want to see more, like and subscribe, slap the notification bell, do all the crap I'm not gonna bother explaining. And with all that said and done, Ladies and gentlemen, I am TTTEN HTF Fan 2012, and I shall see you in the next one. Peace out and have a good one. This is the most scary face I have ever seen.